Demetrius Andrade is a 3-1 underdog against David Benavidez, but in my view, he has a secret weapon that very few people are talking about that could win him this fight. I'm going to get into that in a second, but the first thing I want to say is that this really is a 50-50 fight. Both guys have a legitimate path to victory, and both guys have a legitimate path to losing this fight. So don't believe what you hear that either David Benavidez is just going to blast Demetrius Andrade out, or that David Benavidez is somehow overhyped, overrated, bad footwork, and he's going to be exposed by Demetrius Andrade. In my view, neither of those things are correct. I think both guys are actually excellent fighters, and this is going to be one of the fights of the year in boxing. So I'm super excited. Let's get into how each guy's going to win this. For David Benavidez, it's all going to come down to his ability to wear Demetrius Andrade out with his very good conditioning. We hear about him sparring 15 to 20 rounds against 5 different opponents, and he's been doing that for years. He's been sparring some of the top fighters in the world, Dmitry Bivol, Gennady Golovkin, since he was 15 years old. And if you just look at the guy in the ring, his legs look like tree trunks relative to the division, and he's able to transfer tremendous power from his legs into his punches, and that's why he weighs as much as he does. We're talking about a guy that could fight at light heavyweight, maybe even cruiserweight, but his upper body doesn't look that muscular. It's because he's got so much muscle in his legs, and he's able to transfer that into being a devastating puncher. And that's where I think Demetrius Andrade needs to be extremely careful, because he's fighting a guy who has devastating power, excellent conditioning, has been sparring 15 to 20 rounds throughout his career, and he's very tough. So how do you beat somebody like that? Well, in Demetrius Andrade's case, he has the slick boxing skills to be able to move in such a way that it's very hard for Benavidez to hit him. Because if David Benavidez has one weakness, it's his footwork. It's not the best, and he's fighting a guy who's extremely slick, who's extremely difficult to hit. In almost all of Demetrius Andrade's fights, even the ones where he's been down on the canvas, in most of the rounds, he barely gets touched. And even when he has been down, for instance, in his last fight against Damon Nicholson, which was his debut at super middleweight, it wasn't scored a knockdown, but in my view, he was actually knocked down in the 5th round. In that fight, he bounced straight off the canvas like he wasn't bothered in the slightest, and he won the rest of the round. So even in the fights where he has been knocked down, Demetrius Andrade is still very slick, he's very hard to hit, and crucially, he carries a lot of power himself. He's not a pillow-fisted fighter by any means, and that's very important, because when a boxer fights a power puncher, the boxer can only win if he has the power to actually keep the puncher honest. And so we saw last weekend, for example, or a couple of weekends ago rather, an example of where you had a boxer and a power puncher. And I'm talking about Navarrete against Conceição here. And unfortunately for Conceição in that fight, the power puncher was just able to walk straight through him because his boxing skills didn't match up to his power. He didn't have the power to keep the puncher off him, essentially, is what I'm saying. And we've seen that happen in the past with David Benavidez when he fought Caleb Plant. Caleb Plant's a slick boxer, but he's nowhere near as slick as Demetrius Andrade, in my view. His defense is not as good. He's much easier to hit. He's not as powerful. His foot movement's not as good. He's not as fast. He's not a southpaw. He's an orthodox fighter. He doesn't do anything, in my view, as well as Demetrius Andrade does, but he was able to cause David Benavidez a lot of problems in the first half of the fight. And it was only when his movement started to slow down because he was accumulating damage that he ended up losing the latter half of the fight and ultimately getting beaten on points. But if that hadn't happened, imagine if Caleb Plant had been able to continue out-slicking Benavidez throughout the whole fight. In my view, he would have won a clear points decision. But the reason why he wasn't able to do that is that his movement is not as good as Demetrius Andrade, but also he lacks the power that Demetrius Andrade possesses, because in a lot of Andrade's fights, he's actually had multiple knockdowns, and even though he hasn't really put that many of his opponents away, he's been able to get a surprising number of knockdowns. So we're not talking about a pillow-fisted fighter by any means. When you combine the ability to actually keep David Benavidez honest with the ability to move as well as Demetrius Andrade does, then he does have a path to win this fight. And it's clear to me that he's being underestimated because of the fact that Caleb Plant did so badly in the second half of the fight with Benavidez. But I'm telling you right now, do not base your prediction for this fight on that one, because Caleb Plant and Demetrius Andrade are completely different levels of fighters. Demetrius Andrade is here and Caleb Plant is here. With all due respect, in my opinion, Plant is the bigger name. People are familiar with him from the Canelo fight. But in my view, there's no area of his game in which he's superior to Demetrius Andrade. So in my view, it basically comes down to those two things. Can Andrade frustrate and outmaneuver Benavidez, or can Benavidez hit him, wear him down, slow him down, and either win a points decision or knock him out? But where does the secret weapon come in? In my opinion, the secret weapon that Andrade possesses is his apparent complete lack of ego. Well, what does that have to do with anything? If you look at the Caleb Plant fight, if you look at the David Lemieux fight, and if you look at several of the other opponents that David Benavidez has faced, there was a lot of bravado before those fights, and those guys wanted to prove that they were as tough as he was, that they could punch as hard as he was, and they stood at various points in those fights right in front of him and tried to slug it out. And that's a big, big problem. But when you're talking about Demetrius Andrade, his secret weapon to me is that, number one, he appears to have no kind of macho ego whatsoever in relation to proving his toughness against Benavidez. And what that means is he's not going to be drawn into an exchange where he stands directly in front of him and tries to slug it out. And sometimes your ego can actually get in the way of you executing the game plan that's going to give you the best chance of winning the fight. So a textbook example of that from a recent fight is when Tyson Fury boxed Francis Ngannou. Tyson Fury needed to try and get on the back foot and outbox Ngannou, but he couldn't do that. And the reason why he couldn't was because he'd said so many derogatory things prior to the fight that if he'd ran around the ring, he would have been completely embarrassed. And so as a result, he had to come forward, which actually played directly into Francis's game plan, who was then able to stay relatively stationary and hit Tyson Fury as he came in. And so in the same situation here, if Demetrius Andrade can let go of his ego, not try and prove that he can outslug David Benavidez, and stick to his boxing, that's going to be something which a lot of Benavidez opponents have actually not been able to do, because they've gone in there trying to prove that they have this warrior spirit, and it's got them in trouble and it's cost them fights. And the other reason why I think he has a secret weapon is because of the fact that Demetrius Andrade doesn't seem intimidated by the power that Benavidez possesses. So when you combine his lack of ego, which is going to try and make him engage, with the fact that he's not intimidated by Benavidez's power, you've got a guy who has the ability to both outbox and hurt Benavidez sufficiently enough to keep him honest. And that's a very dangerous combination. So in my opinion, the route to victory for Andrade is to do what I just outlined, keep that going throughout the fight, and you might start to see Benavidez get frustrated. And I think this is where you're going to see one of Benavidez's potential weaknesses exposed. His corner is very inexperienced. He's trained by his father, who by his own admission knew very little about boxing when he started coaching. He's not an experienced trainer. And as a result, I think you could, and also there have been some, problems that have been well documented where they almost split up as a team, as a trainer and a boxer team, and all sorts of things going on apparently behind the scenes. The bottom line is there's a volatile relationship here. There's an inexperience in the corner. And if Andrade can keep calm, can outbox Benavidez, and can frustrate him, I think you might start to see things break down a little bit in the corner, and that's also going to work in Andrade's favor. So the bottom line is, in my view, this is completely a 50-50 fight. I think it could go either way, and a lot's going to come down to whether Andrade can actually outbox Benavidez, or Benavidez can walk through his shots, hit him with power punches, slow him down, and potentially eventually stop him. But the secret weapon, like I say, is the fact that Demetrius Andrade has no intention to go in there either intimidated or trying to show that he can slug it out. And instead, he's going to be able to stick to his game plan and potentially outslick David Benavidez. So those are my thoughts on the fight up to this point. I'm not going to do a final prediction here just because I want to wait until we've seen the last press conference and the weigh-in before I give my final prediction. I am going to be live streaming this entire fight live, which is going to be super exciting. So please join me for that. In the meantime, let me know your thoughts on this fight in the comments. Are you favoring Andrade? Are you favoring Benavidez? Let me know why, and I will catch you guys in the next video. Thank you as always for watching.